The branch manager hadn't raised her voice once. That, more than anything, was what I couldn't stop thinking about. She set the folder on the desk between us, folded her hands over the top of it, and looked at me the way a doctor looks at you right before the room tilts. Quiet, deliberate, careful, in a way that isn't kind so much as it is honest. Through the glass partition behind her, the credit union went about its ordinary Tuesday morning. A teller was counting bills. A woman in a pale yellow sweater was rocking a stroller with her foot while she signed something. Everything was exactly as it should be, and nothing was. "Sir," the manager said. Her name was Miss Caulfield, mid-50s, silver hair pinned back. The calm of someone who had handled unexpected things for a long time and learned not to be undone by them. "Before I can show you anything, I need to understand how you came to be here today." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the small brass key on the desk between us. It was old and dull, the kind of thing you'd find at the bottom of a junk drawer and never think twice about. Except I knew what it had cost my wife to hide it. She had sewn it inside the hem of her apron. But I need to go back to the beginning. My name is Clyde. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a rural mail carrier in a county that has more cows than traffic lights, and I retired 4 years ago with a federal pension that covers the electric bill and not much else. I live in the same white clapboard house I bought with my wife the year we were married, on a gravel road outside a town called Mill Haven, Tennessee, which most people have never heard of, and most of the people who live there prefer to keep it that way. My wife and I were married for 38 years. She passed 7 months ago, quick, as these things sometimes go. A diagnosis in January, and she was gone before the dogwoods bloomed. 38 years of living beside a person, and then nothing, just the space where she used to be. My wife was a quilter, a serious one, the kind of serious that doesn't announce itself. She had been quilting since she was a girl, learned from her grandmother in eastern Kentucky, entered county fairs, won ribbons she kept in a shoebox and never mentioned. There was always something spread across the cutting table in the back room. Even that last winter, even when she was tired in ways that went past tired, she would sit in there in the evenings with the lamp on and stitch while the television murmured in the other room. I'd bring her tea and she would look up and smile, and I would think I am the luckiest man in Mill Haven, Tennessee, and I know it. She used to say something when she was teaching the ladies at the church quilting circle. I heard her say it 100 times. "Take your time with the stitch," she'd tell whoever was rushing. "A seam done right is invisible. A seam done wrong shows itself eventually, and always at the worst moment." I didn't understand until much later that she wasn't only talking about quilts. After she passed, my daughter drove up from Nashville. She and her husband, my son-in-law, had been married 6 years and lived well in ways I had never entirely understood. He worked in real estate development, the kind of work where you wear good shoes and talk about other people's money and refer to yourself as a consultant. He had a handshake 10% too firm and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes no matter what his face was doing. I had never been able to put into words what it was about him that sat wrong with me. My wife had been more measured than me about such things. She didn't speak against people. She observed them. My daughter and my son-in-law stayed 2 weeks after the funeral. They came back the following month, and the month after. By March, my son-in-law was talking about restructuring my finances. "Just to simplify things," he said, very casually, "the way you mention something when you've already decided it." And my daughter was asking whether the house was too much for one person, whether something smaller, something closer to them in Nashville, might make more sense. I had not been thinking about that. I told her so. Around that same time, my accounts started looking different. Small differences, amounts that could be explained by a bill I'd forgotten or an automatic charge I wasn't tracking. My daughter had offered to handle the household bills while she was staying with me after the funeral, just to take one thing off your plate. And I had let her because I was tired and grieving, and she was my daughter. I had trusted her because she was my daughter. That is what trust does. It doesn't ask you to verify, it assumes. I found the key in April. I was going through my wife's things the way you do when you're not ready, but you know you have to. Her quilting room had stayed untouched since January. One Saturday morning I sat in there with a cup of coffee and stayed in the quiet of it for a while before I started folding. I sorted fabric by color the way she had kept it, even though I had no idea what I was going to do with any of it. Her everyday apron, worn blue, soft from washing, faded down the front from years of flour and coffee and mornings, was folded on the end of the cutting table. I picked it up. I was going to add it to the donation pile for the church. When I folded it in half, I felt something stiff inside the hem. I stood there for a long moment before I did anything. Then I found scissors and carefully cut the hem, stitching open from the inside. The stitches were not like the rest of the apron's construction. These were newer, more precise, deliberate in a way that the everyday sewing of a well-used apron is not. The key was wrapped in a small square of muslin. Sewn to the muslin with 2 neat stitches was a folded slip of paper in my wife's handwriting, clear, even, unhurried, the handwriting of a woman who did everything with precision. The paper said, "An account, Greenfield Federal Credit Union, Route 4, Harwick, account number below. Take your birth certificate and our marriage certificate. Go alone. Tell them Ruth sent you." And then, the account number, and below that, underlined twice with one of her fine point pens, "Don't tell him." Ruth was my wife's name. I sat in that quilting room for a long time after I read the paper. Outside the window, the yard was coming green at the edges. A crow was walking across the top rail of the fence like he owned the property. The house was very quiet. My wife had hidden a key. She had sewn it into her apron with careful, deliberate stitches. She had written me instructions. She had told me not to tell my son-in-law. My wife did not do things without reason. Harwick is about 90 miles southeast of Millhaven, across 2 counties and a stretch of ridge road that gets slick in winter but runs clear in spring. I left before 7 in the morning without telling anyone where I was going. About 30 miles out, my phone rang. My daughter. I answered. "Hey, Daddy." Her voice was light, but careful light, the kind of light that listens back. "Where are you headed this early?" "Running an errand," I said. "Taking some boxes to the storage unit." "You should have said something. We could have driven up." "It's nothing big," I said. "Just boxes." A pause on her end. "You didn't take anything from the quilting room yet, did you? Some of Mom's fabrics might actually be worth something to the right buyer. We should go through that room together." "I'm not touching the quilting room," I said, which was, at that point, technically true. I hung up and drove. 20 minutes later, my son-in-law called. "Hey there, Clyde." He always used my name like that, a beat too deliberate, like he was reminding himself. "Your daughter mentioned you're out and about. You doing all right?" "Fine," I said. "You know, if you ever need help with anything, paperwork, accounts, any of Ruth's old policies, you don't have to manage all that alone. Families for that kind of thing." "I appreciate it," I said. "Ruth had some old accounts too," he said almost offhand. "Credit unions, local stuff from years back. Those tend to close out on their own eventually. Usually nothing left in them by the time anyone looks." I didn't say anything to that. "Just didn't want you wasting a trip somewhere," he said. "Chasing something that's probably already gone." I said I understood and hung up. 2 calls, 30 minutes apart, both casual, both telling me in slightly different words not to look at anything. My wife used to say, "A seam done wrong shows itself eventually." The credit union in Harwick was a small brick building with a hand-lettered sign and a parking lot barely bigger than a basketball court. Inside, it smelled like old carpet and the particular hum of small-town banking that hasn't changed in 30 years. I waited at the counter and slid the slip of paper across with my ID and our marriage certificate. The young teller typed something, excused herself, and came back with a woman in her 50s, silver hair pinned back, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the composure of someone who had been the last person in the room when surprising things happened and had learned not to be undone by them. "Miss Caulfield." She looked at the key, at the paper, at my identification, she typed. Her expression didn't change exactly, but the quality of her attention did. "Would you come to my office?" she said. Her office was small and tidy, with a framed needlepoint on the wall that read, "Do right and fear no man." She closed the door gently and sat across from me with the folder flat between her hands. "This account is flagged in our system," she said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else." I asked what that meant. "It means there is a documented record of an unauthorized access attempt," she said. "In 2020, someone presented power of attorney documentation and attempted to withdraw the majority of the balance. Our verification system flagged inconsistencies in the signatures. The transaction was denied. The attempt was logged and retained." I looked at my hands, the faint work stains on my knuckles that 31 years of outdoor routes will leave on a man, no matter how hard he scrubs. "Who made the attempt?" I asked. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see. A name, my son-in-law's name. Beside it, a scanned document, a signature that looked like his name but nothing like his actual hand. Too smooth, too uniform. Practiced the way a forgery is practiced, which is different from the way a real signature is practiced. "And the balance," I said. She wrote a number on a notepad and slid it across the desk. $162,000. My wife, who reused gift bags and bought her quilting fabric from estate sales, and kept a handwritten ledger of every household purchase she had ever made, had left behind $162,000 in an account no one alive had known about, or almost no one. Miss Caulfield asked me to wait. She stepped outside and made a call I couldn't hear. When she returned, she didn't sit back down right away. "Sir," she said quietly, "there's someone who needs to speak with you." A knock at the door. A man stepped in, late 40s, heavy-set, plain clothes, the kind of deliberately unremarkable appearance you see in people who have learned that looking like nothing in particular is sometimes useful. He introduced himself as Agent Ingram, Financial Crimes Division. His handshake was brief and neutral and told me nothing. He asked his questions in the steady, unhurried way of someone who already knew some of the answers and was interested in what the rest of them would confirm, who had handled my household finances since my wife's illness, who had access to her accounts, her mail, her medical records. Had she ever expressed concern about money being moved without her knowledge? Had I ever been told her old accounts were already closed? As he spoke, things I had let sit separately in my memory started arranging themselves into a shape I hadn't been ready to look at directly. My son-in-law offering to look into Ruth's old accounts right after the funeral. As a favor, no rush, just to simplify things. My daughter saying, estate matters get complicated, and the attorney she'd already contacted could handle everything. The month in February when the household account came up $300 short, and my daughter explained it as an automatic payment, I'd forgotten. I had believed her. "Did your wife ever seem frightened?" Agent Ingram asked. I thought about that last winter, the way she would sometimes stop in the middle of something and look out the window toward nothing in particular, farther than the window could really reach. I had assumed it was the illness making her reflective. People get quiet like that when time is running short. She was calm, I said, but I think now that the calm was something she chose. Ingram nodded. He had the expression of a man who had sat in many rooms and heard many versions of this particular story and was still careful with each one. He told me what I needed to do. Go home. Behave normally. Don't confront anyone. Not my daughter, not my son-in-law. If they sensed I knew something, records would disappear. Devices would be wiped. Evidence would become a conversation that had never happened. He was asking me to sit across from my son-in-law at Sunday dinner and say nothing. I said I understood. The drive home was the longest 90 miles I can remember. I had the radio off. I drove through both counties thinking about my wife sitting in the quilting room in the evenings, the lamp, the needle, the soft movement of her hands, doing two things at once, stitching patterns, building a case, preparing something she knew she might not be there to deliver herself. That evening, my daughter called to check in. I told her the errand had been nothing. My son-in-law texted to say he'd found an estate management company in Nashville he thought I should talk to. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything I could remember. Dates. Amounts. Things said offhand over the past 7 months that I hadn't examined at the time. My wife had kept a purchase ledger in the kitchen drawer her whole married life. I had teased her about it once, and she had just looked at me with that particular patience she had. and said, "You never know when you'll need to show your work." She had been right about that too. 3 days later, Agent Ingram called. "We've been pulling records," he said. "The power of attorney your son-in-law presented in 2020, we're confident now that it was forged. The notarization appears fabricated, and there's a business entity registered in his name that's been receiving transfers we're examining closely." He asked if my wife had ever had a personal attorney. Someone old, someone she had trusted before my son-in-law was in the picture. She had. His name was Mr. Rafferty. He was 72 years old, had practiced law in Harwick for his entire career, and had handled the estate of my wife's grandmother before Ruth and I were even married. He and my wife had stayed loosely in touch through the years. I knew him by sight from the times Ruth had mentioned stopping by his office when she was in Harwick visiting relatives. I called him. He was not surprised to hear from me. "I've been expecting your call," he said simply. His office had the particular stillness of a room where serious things had been kept for a long time. Dark wood shelves, old binders, the smell of paper and cedar. He rose slowly when I entered and shook my hand with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of what I was about to be handed. "Ruth came to me 3 years ago," he said. He set his hands flat on a thick manila folder on the desk between us. "She had been collecting evidence for some time before that. Account statements, copies, a written timeline." He looked at me steadily. "She believed your son-in-law had been diverting funds from her personal accounts for at least 4 years. She had traced it herself." The room felt very quiet. My wife, who quilted in the evenings and bought fabric from estate sales and laughed at my bad jokes for 38 years, had been sitting at that cutting table doing 2 things at once all along, stitching patterns and documenting thefts, one visible, one invisible. "Why didn't she go to the police?" I asked. Mr. Rafferty sighed the way old men sigh when the answer is something that should not be the answer but is. "She tried," he said, informally. "But by then your son-in-law had arranged certain things. Your daughter had medical power of attorney. When Ruth raised concerns, they were attributed to confusion. Your daughter had told Ruth's doctor that she'd been mixing up financial details for some time." He paused. The doctor noted it. "Once something like that is in a record, it becomes difficult to correct." I stared at him. "Ruth knew exactly what was happening," he said. "She simply couldn't stop it from where she was, so she prepared for after." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements with amounts circled in red, handwritten notes in my wife's careful hand, documenting transfers she had not authorized, each one dated and annotated, not my signature. Confronted, denied. Confronted again, said I was confused. There were comparison pages with her real signature beside the forged version, her real one showing the slight asymmetry of a hand that had stitched thousands of seams, the forged version smooth and mechanical and wrong in a way that was unmistakable once you knew to look. At the bottom of the folder was a notarized affidavit, dated 14 months before she died. I recognized her handwriting before I read the first word. "I am of sound mind. I have been married for 36 years to a man who trusts people, which is one of the finest things about him, and which is also why I am writing this instead of asking him to. I am documenting what has been done to our finances, so that the record will exist when I no longer can speak for it. I am not confused. I know exactly what I have seen." My vision blurred at the edges. She had written it while she was sick. She had been ill enough by then that some days were harder than others, and she had sat down at some point and written that affidavit with the careful, unhurried hand of a woman who had decided that whatever time she had left, she was going to spend some of it making sure the truth outlasted the lie. "There is one more thing," Mr. Rafferty said. He reached into a drawer and slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "My name on the front, in her handwriting. She asked me to give you this only if you came to the credit union first," he said. "Not before, only if you followed the key." I held the envelope for a while before I opened it. Inside was a single page folded in thirds, the way she always folded letters. "Clyde, if you're reading this, you did what I knew you would do. You went carefully. You didn't let them talk you out of it. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was still there. I needed you to find it yourself, because finding it yourself means you'll know it all the way down, not just in your head, but in the place where you know things for certain. Don't be angry for too long. Anger is loud and it uses you up. Let the right people do their work. The stitch that holds is the one you take twice. I folded the letter and held it against my chest for what must have been several minutes. Mr. Rafferty was quiet. He had the patience of a man who had been the last keeper of many truths and understood that some moments needed to be allowed to settle. Agent Ingram called 4 days later. The warrants had been filed. Tomorrow, he said, simultaneous. Stay home. Don't be at either location. I'll call you when it's done. I thanked him and sat in my wife's quilting room until the light went out of the windows. The next morning I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my hands around the mug, watching the yard come light the way I had watched it every morning for 34 years in this house. At 7:20, my phone buzzed. "It's done," Ingram said. My daughter had been at her house in Nashville. She answered the door in her robe, coffee cup in hand. She tried surprise first, then dignity, then the smooth explanation she'd been refining for years. My son-in-law was at a breakfast meeting. He stood up when the agents walked in, raised his hand mid-sentence, like he could redirect the whole thing with the right word. He could not. I wasn't there for any of it. I found out sitting in my driveway with the engine off, listening to a cardinal working its way through the hedge at the edge of the yard, like it was any other morning. That afternoon, my son-in-law's attorney called. His voice was measured and practiced, the voice of a man who had talked his way past difficult things before. He told me there had been misunderstandings, that families sometimes got sideways with finances during grief, that my daughter was distressed and wanted to make things right, that a portion of the funds could be returned if we handled this as a family matter rather than a legal one. "A portion," I said. "Yes," he said, "given the circumstances, your wife's condition toward the end, the informal nature of some of the arrangements." My wife's signature was not hers, I said, and she was not confused. Silence. "I already know what I'm going to do," I told him, and I hung up. The investigation ran 6 months. My son-in-law's real estate business had a subsidiary company that had received transfers documented as consulting fees. The forensic accountants called it a layered disbursement structure. I called it what it was. My daughter, in the course of the investigation, gave 3 different accounts of what she had known and when. The evidence from my wife's folder, and from the credit union's records, and from the affidavit she had signed 14 months before she died, was more consistent than any of those accounts. My daughter wrote me letters. I read them. In the first, she said I had broken the family. In the second, she said she hadn't understood the full extent of what her husband was doing. In the third, she said she was sorry without specifying for what. I don't know which of those was the truth. Maybe she doesn't either. Sentencing was on a gray Tuesday in February. My son-in-law received 9 years, federal. My daughter received 3, with restitution. The judge said it plainly. This was not miscommunication, not grief-affected judgment, not an informal family arrangement. It was a sustained and calculated exploitation of a woman who had spent her final years unable to trust the people closest to her. I sat in the second row with my hands folded in my lap and felt nothing dramatic, just the particular quiet of something that has been held in suspension for a very long time finally coming to rest. Outside on the courthouse steps afterward, Agent Ingram shook my hand. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. The accounts were untangled, the assets were liquidated, most of the money came back, not all but most. I let Mr. Rafferty oversee it. He was careful and thorough, the way my wife had trusted him to be. With what came back, I did 3 things. I paid off the house. The deed is clear now, and some evenings I sit on the porch and look at the yard we looked at together for 34 years, and sometimes the light falls at a certain angle, and I can almost feel her beside me. I set up a small fund at the county senior center for free legal consultations. Anyone over 60 who thinks something is wrong with their finances and doesn't know where to start. Mr. Rafferty agreed to consult. 2 other attorneys signed on. I named it after my wife. And I kept the apron. It hangs in the quilting room where it always hung, on the hook beside the cutting table. The hem is still open where I cut the stitching to find the key, and I have not repaired it. Some people who come by notice it and ask, and I tell them a little of the story. Not all of it, just enough. They always look at the apron differently after that. My wife used to say the best seam is the one that holds when everything else is under tension. She spent the last years of her life making one. Slow, careful, invisible, and she trusted me to be the one to carry it when she could not. I think about that in the evenings when the house is quiet. She had sewn her whole faith in me into that hem, right alongside the key, and she had closed it with stitches so careful and deliberate that it took me 38 years to deserve them. The truth doesn't make noise when it's waiting. It just holds.